So a friend sent me an article from the Wall Street Journal recently about how the Civil War sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, which we have been living through since 2011, and will be coming to an end soon, has been a bust financially. The Wall Street Journal is interested in money, commerce. People who at shops and other places near Civil War sites or other places who stocked up on all sorts of memorabilia and other items to sell are stuck with all this stuff. It hasn't proved a big commercial success. We were hoping for more tourist traffic than we've seen, says one guy. It's disappointing. And they're trying to figure out why. Why are people not kind of all excited about the 150th anniversary of the Civil War? Well, one explanation, you can decide for yourself if this is true, younger Americans have other things on their minds, from social media to superheroes. Civil War doesn't count. The public is not aware of it or not interested in it, says one guy who's not making money here. Gary Gallagher, a historian, very good Civil War historian at University of Virginia, says the reason the anniversary is anemic is it's hard to talk about if you don't mention race, slavery, and emancipation, and people are uncomfortable with that. Another major factor is widespread ignorance, says one Civil War historian. Significant numbers of people have no idea when the Civil War occurred, let alone what it was about. A poll asked Georgians last summer what they thought of Union General William T. Sherman. The poll found most people don't care one way or the other about Sherman. 56% had no opinion of Sherman at all, and only 28% disliked him. In comparison, 63% disliked the reality TV the reality TV star Honey Boo Boo. I personally don't know who that is, but he's much more unpopular in Georgia than William T. Sherman. So, however, I am very glad to admit that I got this invitation in the mail for something. They are now trying to commemorate the Reconstruction era in an odd sort of way. This is an invitation to a Decades Ball sponsored by a magazine, Lapham's Quarterly. They're trying to raise money by people buying tickets to this dinner and Decades Ball. What decade are they celebrating? The 1870s, okay? That's our decade right now. This event is to honor our colleague, Simon Schama, Professor Simon Schama of our own history department. Now, as Richard Nixon used to say, let me make one thing perfectly clear. What I am about to say is not in any way a criticism of my good friend and colleague, Professor Schama. He deserves all the accolades and honors he can get. However, I think it's odd to choose the 1870s as the decade to kind of reenact or channel what happened in, the main events of the 1870s, as far as I can see, are one, the Ku Klux Klan and other similar organizations running amok and murdering people. Are they going to give him his award by someone dressed in a Klan outfit? I don't know. I hope not. Or the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which we'll talk about in a minute, the first national railroad strike in American history, where the high or low point of it was when the Philadelphia militia came to Pittsburgh and shot down dozens of striking railroad workers. Is that what they're going to reenact at the Lapham's Ball? I don't know. The decade. So I think this is not the way we want to remember the Reconstruction era somehow. But it's, if anyone wants, well, actually, yeah, what are you supposed to wear? Festive attire. I don't know if Klan robes qualify, but all right. The year 1876 was, as you know, the 100th anniversary, the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. And this, of course, stimulated a lot of reflection, a lot of celebration. visual imagery. Here's one well-known lithograph. I'm going to cut this down a little so you can see it. Progress of the century. This is an image from 1876 highlighting 4 great technological achievements of the century since independence. The steam-powered press over on the left. These are modes of communication and transportation. The steam-powered press, the telegraph right in front, the railroad, and the steamboat. Century of technological progress. But linked in a way to the Union victory in the Civil War, because at the very bottom, coming out of the telegraph, it says, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Daniel Webster's great peroration from his debate with Hayne back in the 1830s, but now this is what the victory in the Civil War has sort of consolidated. Another lithograph of that period, or a painting very widely reproduced, Across the Continent. Another celebration of progress and definition of progress. Here we see a railroad heading into the West, a town having sprung up with the symbols of civilization. A church is in there, a school is in there. There are people in wagons heading west. Of course, the image here is of the West as totally empty, right? They're going into a totally empty terrain. There are a couple of Native Americans right up here. Way, way up in the top, you can't really see it, a buffalo herd. But this is it's just the settlement of an empty space. The notion that there were actually people living there who were going to be displaced in a rather violent mode is not the image of, but this again is another image of progress. Westward expansion and the civilization. And this is northern civilization, right? This is the small town, the school, the church, the railroad, spreading now out. Remember, in the 1850s, the country had gone to war in part over whether slavery should spread into the West or not. Now that issue no longer exists. The West will become like the North is. One other image, let's see where we can find it. Here we go. This, of course, is from the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, the sort of World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of independence. This is the centerpiece of that, the giant Corliss engine, an immense steam engine, which was the kind of physical symbol of technological prowess and progress. It towered over everything. It was completely useless. In fact, it barely worked. And after the exposition, they sold it for scrap metal, basically. There was nothing to do with this Corliss engine. But nonetheless, as you can see, it's a very imposing thing, and it kind of towers over everyone as a symbol of technological progress. The Philadelphia Exposition, which I mentioned in my book a little bit, it sort of symbolized many things going on in the country in 1876. Technological progress, women's protest. Elizabeth Cady Stanton turned up with Women's Declaration of Independence to be read, even though she wasn't invited, on July 4th, 1876, demanding the right to vote for women. After all, if government is based on the consent of the governed, as the Declaration of Independence says, what reason is there that half the population is excluded from the ability to give their consent or not to who is ruling over them? There was a bale of cotton from Davis Bend, the plantation of Jefferson Davis. But beneath the surface, there were also signs of the retreat from Reconstruction. Blacks had almost no role in the Philadelphia Exposition. They were not allowed to be employed in the construction crews, and that was important because in 1876, the country was in the depths of the worst economic depression in its history, which had begun with the Panic of 1873 and would last all the way to 1878. So jobs in construction were very desirable. And in the following year, as I just mentioned, came what's called the Great Railroad Strike, the first national strike in American history of railroad workers from New England all the way out into the West and parts of the South. The Great Railroad Strike symbolized, you might say, the transition from the issue of slavery and its aftermath to the relations of capital and labor as the fundamental problem confronting the country. And it inaugurated decades, 3 or 4 decades, in which the United States experienced a degree of labor violence unprecedented in the Western world. No other country experienced the continual violent struggles between employer and employee that marked the United States from 1877 down into the first part of the 20th century. This is when in the aftermath of the railroad strike, which also, by the way, witnessed one of the most violent insurrectionary acts in American history, when after the militia were brought in to shoot down the strikers in Pittsburgh, the outraged railroad workers burned the Pittsburgh railroad yards, destroying millions, tens of millions of dollars of property of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest corporation in the nation at that time. And as a result of that, the government began to start building armories in major cities, arms and places for soldiers. You may have heard of the Armory Show of 1913. Our colleague, Professor Blake, just organized a wonderful exhibition marking the 100th anniversary, the time when European modern art was introduced to America in the Great Armory Show. But very few people, why is there an armory on Park Avenue in this city? Why is there an armory there? That seems kind of odd. It was built in the early 1880s. It was because of fear of literally violent class conflict. Armories like that were built in all the cities. They did not build armories in the South to house soldiers in order to try to protect the constitutional rights of American citizens, which were being violated in the South. They did build armories in the North so that troops could be there to protect the rights of property if in the case of this kind of violence. And in fact, when we talked about the so-called bargain or compromise of 1877, and we always say, Hayes agreed to remove troops from the South. And as I mentioned, that's not quite right. He removed the troops from participation in Southern government. They didn't come out of the South for 3 more months. They were brought out of the South in July 1877 in order to be sent in against the railroad strikers. So the troops who were no longer allowed to protect black citizens in the South were allowed to come up to the North on the side of capital in this violent struggle, just the beginning of a very violent period in American history.